Now, I'm going to talk about the Goddards, the Goddard family of Aldbourne and Upham. Most of us are aware of the Goddards. Some of our guests on Zoom are more aware than others. And I'm going to talk about them as landowners, as benefactors, particularly to our church, and the other side as poachers. Now, this is a talk which I was originally intending to give on May the 8th to a meeting of the Goddard Association at their annual get-together, which this year was going to be here in the village. Unfortunately, on May the 6th, I came down with COVID. And so the plan for this talk fell apart. But I promised that I would give the talk sometime later. And so here I am giving it as one of our heritage talks in the village. But we have invited, and we do have via Zoom, a number of the members of the Goddard Association who would have had the pleasure of hearing this 4 months ago. They've had rather a long wait. So, landowners, benefactors, and poachers. As I say, this was originally intended for members of the Goddard Association who don't necessarily know a great deal about Aldbourne. So the beginning of the talk introduces Aldbourne and its manorial history, because that's where it becomes important early on. So those of us in the room, most of us will have heard much of this already. For that, I apologize, but I hope you'll bear with us. Now, is this going to work, I wonder? Good. The first record of Aldbourne, many people believed, and was believed for a long time, was in the will of Alfred the Great. But in fact, that section of Alfred the Great's will left a number of manors, including one called Aldbourne, but they were all clustered together in the area in Sussex and around Sussex. Almost certainly it related to the village of Aldbourne near Brighton. So we can forget the will of Alfred the Great. Please all forget the will of Alfred the Great and move on about 70 years. And about 70 years on, another of the nobles of Wessex, a man called Alfhere, he really did leave Aldbourne in his will. And his will still exists to this day. And it includes the words, "And he again Alfhere his brother, his lands at Ferndunnen, and at Aldingburnen. And he grants to his brother Alfhere the estates at Farringdon and Aldbourne." And that, we're now fairly well convinced, is the first record of Aldbourne. So there's been a settlement here, a named settlement here, for over 1,000 years. By 1066, the Battle of Hastings, Aldbourne had come into the hands of the Lady Githa, Countess of Wessex, the wife of Earl Godwin and the father of King Harold, he of the arrow at the Battle of Hastings. Following the Battle of Hastings, William the Conqueror confiscated all royal lands in England and took them as his own domain. And if we look at the entry in Domesday, which was written in 1086, here is the entry for Aldbourne. If we look at the first, let me set my laser pointer on, the first line says Rex tenuit Aldbourne, Geitha tenuit TRE. And that translated is the king holds Aldbourne, Geitha held it, TRE, Tempus Rex Edwardii, in the time of King Edward. So we know from Doomsday that Geitha was the lady of the manor in 1066. If we go on with the entry in Doomsday, we find that Aldbourne was quite a large, prosperous village. There were 73 villagers, 14 freemen, 6 burgesses, that's the sort of the upper echelons of local society, 25 slaves, and 38 others. These would be people like wheelwrights and blacksmiths and other artisan types. When it mentions 73 villagers, it doesn't mean that there were 73 people. It means there were 73 households. These people that are mentioned are the heads of households. So you can perhaps multiply those numbers by 6 to get a village of perhaps 7, maybe a little bit more, 700 or so souls. It tells us also there were land for 47 ploughs, which is a very big agricultural area. The Lord himself works with 12 ploughs, and there are 26 other men in the village who have their own. There were 4 mills, and there was a church. And the most important thing of all to the king, it was worth £62 a year to him in rent and dues and what have you. Throughout the medieval period, or the middle medieval period, it passed through various hands of favorites of the king, and the king would take it back. If somebody displeased them, they might have their land sequestered. That did happen, particularly to the Lord of the Manor of Aldbourne at one point, who was on the wrong side of one of the Barons' wars. But by 1365, it had come to John of Gaunt, who was Earl of Lancaster. His son, Henry Bolingbroke, became Duke of Lancaster, and after deposing King Richard II, he became King Henry IV. And so from that point on, Aldbourne was a royal manor once again under the Duchy of Lancaster, until, that is, 1625, when King James I and King Charles I, between them, ran up such enormous debts to the City of London that they had to hand over a lot of their manors in order to pay off their debts, and Aldbourne was one of those. What King William had retained all of this time was his royal rabbit warren, which he had set up in the area to the northwest of the village, all the downland running out towards Swindon, towards Wanborough and Liddington, was a royal rabbit warren. And the southern area of the manor, a royal chase, where the king and his cronies could hunt deer, and which existed under forest law. The setup of the manorial system here in Aldbourne led to the rise of 2 very prominent families. One were the Walrons, or Waldron or Walrond. They seem to use the name almost interchangeably. They were all descendants of the man who William I had put in charge as keeper of his chase, a man called Walleran. The other major family, the Goddards. They don't appear to have been here at the time of King William. They first start to appear in records of the village sometime in the early 1200s. They appear as landowners. They also appear from time to time acting as stewards for the Duchy of Lancaster or for the Lord of the Manor at the time. As stewards, they collected that rent, that £62 that went to the king, and they were entitled to siphon off a certain amount into their own pocket. The Goddards that we know of start to appear in the records in 1249. There are probably some earlier than that, but the ones that I've found, they appear in the civil pleas of the Wiltshire heir. Now, the Wiltshire heir, in fact, the heir in general, that was the forerunner of the quarter sessions. It was the royal courts that toured the country and would sit in various county seats from time to time through the year and hear all civil and criminal proceedings. And the records of the heir in Wiltshire for 1249 still exist. And there are a number of people who appear in there, people who are Goddards. Although the very earliest references use a slightly different name of Goddarville. And we have a John he's written in the heir as Cardaville, but almost certainly he was actually Goddarville. And in 1249, he gave 2 marks for a license to purchase some land. And Agnes, the wife of Walter, claimed that John de Cardaville should provide a house and land for her dower for some reason that I think to modern eyes is totally unintelligible as to why. But it seems that John agreed and he surrendered the house and land to the court. Walter de Goddarville, now we're getting closer to the name Goddard. He overstayed his lease on a house in Chippenham and was taken to court to be evicted. He himself brought a writ about erecting a gallows. Now, whether he was intending to actually hang some person or just something, it's not entirely clear, but whatever it was, he never finished it. And he's also one of his own villains, one of the men who was held in service to him, a man called William Colleram, complained that Walter had repossessed a house and had evicted William from his house. And so he went to the court to claim that that should not have happened. William de Cardaville, in other records, which may well be the same person with just a different scribe writing their name, for some of the courts he served as a juror, and he also claimed that he'd been deprived of land in Marlborough. And next we have a Walter de Cardaville, who the records say held Chippenham and Salden, the 2 manors of Chippenham and Salden, of the king's gift for a quarter of a knight's fee. That would mean that he was liable should the king go to war or be faced with any military action or whatever. He would have to turn up mounted and fully armored with his weapons and with a small coterie of his men also armed and ready for battle to do whatever the king's bidding was. Or he might have to do any other service to the king. He might have to go and serve at court for a certain time. Many things, services would be required of tenants who, under the feudal system, who owed the king some form of fee. Roger Goddard. Finally, we have a Goddard, an actual Goddard. However, he was accused of theft, but he didn't bother to turn up in court. And one of his mates that had been accused with him was obviously found guilty and was hanged. And Roger and the rest of his friends, they were all acquitted. There's no record of why or what they were accused of theft of, but just that it happened. Walter Goddard, this is even worse. He was accused of murder. The murder, fine lot, these Goddards, I don't know. He was accused with others of the murder of Edith O'Frey's brother. But the jurors looked at Walter and his friends and thought, no, they're not the type. Perhaps the victim was very sick and died of natural causes. Again, no more details of what or why, but not sure that would happen these days. Perhaps they needed Inspector Barnaby or somebody to sort out what was actually going on. Here in Aldbourne, we finally get Goddards here actually in Aldbourne, and they first appear, as far as I can find, in the 1332 tax list, where Richard Goddard in Aldbourne paid a tax of 9p on one piece of land and 7 shillings and 4p, which is a pretty heavy tax, so it must have been a big piece of land. Also in Aldbourne, and his relation Walter Goddard, who had his property at Snap, he paid as tax 14p. 1405, William Goddard of Great Oakbourne, which is, we would call Ogbourne St. George, he was reported to the Dean of Sarum in one of his visitations for refusing to pay his tithes on 2 of the houses. And in 1409, 4 years later, he then reported to the Dean that some official had been withholding church funds. Now, I don't know whether that's just his defense to what he'd been accused of 4 years before, or whether that's a completely separate item, misdemeanor. Again, is not clear in what's been left to us. Hello, that wasn't supposed to happen. Where are we? My fingers are getting lost. 1566, we come to Thomas. Thomas is the gentleman who those of us who know Aldbourne Church will know of as the patriarch of the large tomb, who kneels in his doublet and hose along with the rest of his family. But before, in his earlier life, before he needed to erect his tomb, he'd been sued for £200 by Henry Compton of Compton Winyates. But again, Thomas failed to appear at court. And so he was served with notices for debt. He obviously didn't learn his lesson, because 30 years later, he appeared in Chancery again, this time on a charge of £2,000 debt, which you're talking now in the sort of £100,000 and more in today's terms. That's an enormous amount of money. And it's interesting to think that maybe a lot of the growth, the landowning, was actually funded by debt. We tend to think of mortgages and borrowing money to buy a house as something that goes on in the banking system in modern times, and how did it happen before there were banks? But it's obviously is quite clear that it did. And they tended to be personal debts to individuals. So if you failed to pay up, you still ended up in trouble. Now we come to somebody that we know well, Richard Goddard of Upham. Richard Goddard of Upham, he is commemorated along with his second wife, Elizabeth, in the brass memorial set in the floor at the entrance to the Goddard Chapel in Aldbourne Church. And it's a marvelous brass rubbing, and it's a rubbing that I always take up the carpet so that it can be seen, to show to the our American guests that we take on walks around the village. Because Elizabeth, it mentions Richard and his wife Elizabeth. It leaves Richard's date of death blank because he was obviously alive at the time that the brass was created. But it does tell us that Elizabeth died on the 14th of July, 1492. And our American guests find 1492 a very significant date in their history, and are positively astonished that we should have memorials in the church that date back to that time. Anyway, in those days, you could not write a will in the same way that we do today. In a will, you could dispose of personal property. In other words, things that you owned. You could not include land in your will, and you did not have personal control over who your land and estate was left to after your death. That was all controlled by a legal system and a legal hierarchy. And what was necessary was for the apparent heirs to appear before a court called an inquisition post-mortem, an inquisition after death. And Richard Goddard's inquisition post-mortem took place on the 18th of July, 1508. Sorry, that's not true. It took place on the my notes here are very confusing. On the 23rd of July, 1508. And it tells us that Richard Goddard himself actually died. This is where I was getting confused, sorry. Died on the 18th of July, 1505. And he left. And this is a list of the property which he owned at the time of his death. He died on the 18th of July, 1505. And Joan Yate, aged 30 years and more, is his daughter and heir. He had no sons still living in 1505. So Joan, his daughter, who had married John Yate, became his heir. And she inherited 5 houses, gardens, and 16 acres of land in Aldbourne. 3 houses, land, meadows, and woods in Upham. A number, the document is damaged, so there are pieces missing. A number of houses, land, and woodland in Upham. So this is different from the original 3. A house and 20 acres in Aldbourne. Again, different from what was mentioned before. A house in Ramsbury. A house and land in Aldbourne St George. A house in Swindon. and a house, land, meadow, and woods in Eastcote. So he's a fairly prosperous, land-owning, probably sheep-owning wool merchant. That's where most of the riches of this area came from at that period, is from the production of wool, which was exported all across Europe. Europe clamored for English wool. So Richard Goddard was quite a rich man. And we're aware of that amount of land in 1505. And we can see from the records how the Goddards expanded their land holdings. We've got a number of surveys of the manor. 1509, 4 years later, Henry VIII requested a survey of his manor of Aldbourne, of which we have a copy in the centre. And it lists all of the people who rent land and own land in the village. 1552, there's another. This is, you can see from the illustration there, we know it from a modern document, a transcription that was written probably sometime in the 1890s, 1900 era. Some gentleman or lady sat in the British Museum looking at two of the documents in the Phillips collection that related to Aldbourne and transcribed them into a book. Since then, those documents from the Phillips collection have been lost or possibly sold into private hands, but they are no longer available for research. So all we have are these transcriptions, but it gives us the list of tenants of Aldbourne in 1552. We have in 1560, Queen Elizabeth ordered an inquiry into the boundaries and the game in the manor of Aldbourne. 1591, another survey of the manor, which is the second of the documents that our late Victorian gentleman transcribed for us, fortunately. And that's an interesting document because as part of the document, it contains a perambulation of the manor. So they went out on the morning of this inquiry and actually walked around, or perhaps on horseback, more likely, went around the boundaries of the manor, did the beating the bounds. And it's clear from the document that they actually went the other way around from the way that we go today. And then in 1603, there's yet another survey, which is a very interesting one. There's actually two copies of that, which are remarkably alike. One is in very neat handwriting, one is dreadful, but quite clearly it's been well copied. They are, what their contents is virtually identical, which is good. And then 10 years later, 1613, a spider wrote another survey of the manor, the most disgusting handwriting that I haven't yet transcribed. I have tried bits of it. It's really, really hard. And then finally, 1659, the last survey that I know of the manor, was actually just a survey of the chase itself, which tells us that the chase comprised 1,490 acres, and that there had been 400 fallow deer on the chase, but they'd all been killed during the Civil War. So I think the people of Aldbourne may have got a little fatter over the years of the interregnum. Let's look at the one in 1509. Here's the opening page, and they're highlighted there is the name of John Goddard, who was one of the witnesses to the survey. The steward, the high steward of the Duchy of Lancaster, didn't come down with a book with all of the rents and properties listed. He came down and asked a group of people in the village who held what, and had to take their word for it. Anyway, John Goddard, he held 3 properties and land in High Street, which is the area around the church and the green, was then known as High Street. He also held a property known as, or a place called Dockin. And where in Aldbourne is a place called Dockin? That's been lost in the mists of time. John Goddard again had another cottage in the village. He wouldn't have lived in all of these places. He would have rented them out to others. He also held a house with 2 virgates of land, which is quite a lot of land, at Snap. And at Upham, a house and another virgate of land at Upham. And a Thomas Goddard, he held a tenement and a virgate of land that had previously been held by Richard Goddard, who of course is the Richard Goddard on the brass memorial, who had died 4 years before this survey. So Thomas had obtained some of the land. And John Goddard, I'm not sure if it's the same John mentioned in Aldbourne, but he rented Pikewood, which is basically Stock Close and Lanes area in the far southwest of the village. He rented Pikewood with a man called William White. And again, he appears to have held land in Wanborough, and it mentions again a farm called Pikewood. Now, whether there was a farm in Wanborough also called Pikewood, or whether the scribe has got a little bit confused and has mentioned Pikewood property twice. Again, at this distance, we can't really tell. But again, there's quite significant property here. 1552, there's even more. There's an enormous amount of property. One of the things that's interesting about this list is that you start off with a tenement and 1 virgate of land in Snap called Ayres. A little further down, a land called Hunts, land called Hobbs, Rawlins, Fedders, Longs, Appleby's, Brays. These are all surnames. These are all the names of people who'd owned that same land sometime previously, and the land had acquired their name and carrying forward the land, the fields, the whatever the estate was, the property had acquired those names. You'll notice that there was a tenement in Baden Street, which I assume is Baden Hill, and another in Lotwitcher, which is obviously Lottage. And Calf Street, so that was the third thing I was going to point out. Calf Street, that's the old name of Castle Street. In 1590, the surveyor was a little bit suspicious of all the people who were claiming freehold over land. And so all the way through, he tells us that people like Anthony Goddard claim as freehold a tenement and 12 acres. Thomas Goddard of Upham claims as freehold a tenement and 25 acres, a house garden, 24 acres at Upham called Kinders, a house and 36 acres in Snap, and a meadow called Welshmead. Now, I don't know today that if we know where Welshmead was, but that's certainly a name, a field name that I've come across in a lot of documents around the 15 and 1600s. So Welshmead was quite a well-known place, but we have no idea where it was. Thomas Goddard of Standen. Now, this is a different branch of the Goddard family. This is the branch from Millie, what is it, Standen? Standen Hussey, that's right, Standen Hussey. Thomas Goddard of Standen. He also held property in Aldbourne. He held land called Appleby's, which we'd heard mentioned in one of the previous surveys, and the other called Bray's. Now, both of those had appeared in the previous survey. They now belong to the Standen Hussey branch of the Goddard family. And then it also mentions John Goddard claims as freehold, but forgets to tell us what it is that he claimed. Clearly, the centre of the Goddard family in the area was Upham and their house at Upham. And there exists a representation of the house at Upham as it was in 1598. And it's in a very badly damaged map that's held by the National Archives. That doesn't look much like a map, I'm afraid, but it was made before our modern map standards had been set, with the result that north is not at the top of this map, north is at the right, over by the ACHG Dabchick, south on the left, and east at the bottom. So you have to think of this turned anti-clockwise 90 degrees to get an idea of how it would look on a modern map. Down in the bottom corner, down here, we can see labeled a number of cottages on a street labeled Snap. This is the lost village of Snap. And going up the hill to the north, we come to the farmhouse at Hayden, belonging to the Martin family. And finally, here in the corner, are you going to work for me? Yes. Here in the corner, we have Upham House displayed. Now, that doesn't look like the present Upham House, and I suspect that this is the previous, what by 1598 was probably a slightly tumbled down property. And I say it was probably slightly tumbled down because in 1599, 1 year after that map, they decided to build a new house. And this is the new house, more or less as it was built. This drawing was made before the end of Victoria's reign. So this was drawn sometime in the I think it says there 1894, this drawing. Because then early in the 20th century, around about 1910, it underwent major remodeling and a whole new wing was added to it. So it became the building that we know today, but also much larger and not quite of the same aspect as this original house from 1599. As I say, it was remodeled in about 1910, and then in 1960, the large house was split into apartments, and that's how it exists today, as a number of different apartments in Upham House. Now, in the 14th and 15th centuries, the Goddard family had become, as we've seen from their land holdings, increasingly rich, increasingly well off, increasing their land holdings, and no doubt increasing the ready money in their pockets, even despite the fact that they ended up owing people £2,000. They seem to have had extremely deep pockets themselves anyway. So 14th, 15th century was a very prosperous era. By this time, they had also owned land in Swindon. They owned quarries at Purton by the middle of the 15th century. And they had a certain standing amongst in the county and amongst their peers. They had a certain standing that they perhaps felt wasn't really reflected in the rather dull, badly lit, old-fashioned church in Aldbourne. And perhaps the church ought to reflect the village's status and wealth. It was small and dark. It had old lancet windows, very little light. But perhaps it also didn't reflect their status, the Goddard family and the other major families in the village. And of course, at that period, they had the afterlife to think about. What could they do to improve their lot when they passed on? And one of the things they could do was good works for the church. And so Richard Goddard, he of the brass memorial, he decided he would work to rebuild the church and improve the church. Some of the other families decided that they would prepare their souls for life ever after by creating a fraternity dedicated to the Virgin Mary, and that they, as part of the upgrade of St. Michael's, or at that time St. Mary's Church, they would build a lady chapel and install a fraternity to say masses for them for all eternity. Richard, however, he decided that his best efforts would go into improving the church as a whole. And so he set his masons to work, possibly masons from over at his quarries in Purton, but he set masons to work. And the first thing they did was to remove the old tower, which was in the center of the church. That was removed, and they built a new north and south transept, much higher than the old ones, with wonderful perpendicular style, the very latest perpendicular style windows to the north and the south. And they also built the Goddard Chapel to the south of the south aisle, running from there to the porch, which they also built. The Lady Chapel, at the same time, was built by the fraternity. Having built these wonderful new chapels, and the great north and south transepts, they overpowered the church as it stood. And so they needed to raise the walls of the main church itself. So they were raised, and they were also now pierced with windows to form a clear story, to let more light into the church. The roof was lowered. And a few feet from the west end of the existing church, they built the tower, the new tower, the tower that we see today. When the tower was complete, they removed the east wall of the church and built the church out the remaining few feet to meet the tower. But one thing they did with the with the west wall, I've said the east door, it's the west door, I do apologize. It's the west door, which was part of the original church from 1160. They dismantled and re-erected as the new south door. That's the door inside the porch with the wonderful Norman Romanesque arch, the semicircular arch. That was originally the west door. One thing that is completely unclear is at the same time, the church was rededicated from St. Mary Magdalene, which it had been since the earliest medieval times, and it was rededicated to St. Michael the Archangel. And we have, as far as I'm aware, no record and no inkling as to why that change took place, whether that was the responsibility of Richard Goddard or whoever. But that's when that dedication was changed. Now we come to the last part of my talk, poaching. Poaching. The Goddards were quite adept at it, it seems. They did it for quite a while. In 1560, Queen Elizabeth ordered an inquiry because word had reached her that people were hunting deer in her wood. And so, no, you don't have it yet. A set of interrogatories were created. Interrogatories are questions that should be put to witnesses in order to determine a case. And the first paragraph of this up here, it says, interrogatories on behalf of our sovereign lady, the Queen, touching the contempt of Aldbourne Chase in the county of Wilts. And then it goes on with a list, numbered list, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and all the way through. I think there are 15 in total of questions. And there are things like, how long have you known the Chase and the Wood? Do the deer and conies, the rabbits, do they belong to the king or queen or to somebody else? Have any unauthorized people hunted there in the last 4 years or ever before the last 4 years? So there's obviously, she's heard that something in the last few years has been going amiss in her forest. Have the Warreners always set vermin traps in the wood? And did the Woodward, not Edward Woodward, have an acre of wood for his own use? The Woodward was the man who was responsible for maintaining the wood, who would be cutting down undergrowth and making clearings and so forth. And he had a perk of an acre of woodland that he could use for his own purposes. So is that true or is that not true? There obviously was some kind of dispute. Were the tithes paid to Aldbourne and not to Ogbourne? There was an ongoing border dispute between Aldbourne and Ogbourne. Where are the borders of the chase towards Ogbourne? Is Prior's Wood in Aldbourne Parish, that's Chasewoods today, in Aldbourne Parish, and does it belong to the king and or the queen? All to do with a long running, went on for a century and more, battle between the royal manor of Aldbourne and the manor of Ogbourne St George, which was held by King's College, Cambridge. And Ogbourne were constantly trying to push the border further up the hill onto Aldbourne land, so that they, presumably, so that they got access to the deer. Have the tenants of Ogbourne had herbage? Have they had the right to pasture their animals in the woods? So again, all to do with this battle, Ogbourne and Aldbourne. Have the keepers used the browse from the wood to feed the deer, which is a reasonable thing to do, the sort of thing they should do. And finally, and most relevant to us, has Vincent Goddard or his servants hunted recently? Anyway, an inquiry was held using those interrogatories. And here we are, here is the report of the inquiry. And again, the first paragraph here, it says, the dispositions of certain persons examined upon interrogatories by Thomas Walron on behalf of our sovereign lady, the Queen, taken at Dudmore Lodge in the Chase of Aldbourne in the county of Wilts, the 28th day of November, 1560, as ensueth. And then for each witness that came forward, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on, answers to each of those interrogatories. I'm not going to go through the whole document. It's about 20 pages long. 11 witnesses were called. They all agree that the Chase and Woods belong to the Queen. They all agree that nobody hunted there recently, and until recently, when Thomas Walron's servants have disturbed people carrying out hunts. And yes, the Warreners set the traps as they should, and the Woodward, yes, has always had an acre of woodland for himself. So they agree that that is the custom of the manor, and that would be maintained. The tithes are indeed paid to the vicar of Aldbourne and not to Ogbourne. The bounds of Aldbourne were perambulated this morning and do not follow the marks of Ogbourne, who have no rights in the wood. So the people of Aldbourne are quite sure they know where the boundary should lie. The keepers, yes, have used the browse, and at Whitsun, Vincent Goddard and many others with him hunted and destroyed traps. One of his servants, William Drake, even confessed so on examination earlier in the year, in June. So it's fairly clear that Vincent Goddard has been availing himself of the Queen's deer and no doubt enjoying them. Still, the dispute goes on over the manor, over the Aldbourne Chase. 1607, we've moved on to James I, and he's upset at the way that the, excuse me, at the way that the Walrons and the Goddards are carrying on. And he too takes them to court. And as part of the preparation for the court, he has this wonderful map created, which is in the National Archives in Kew, and of which we have a copy on display in the Heritage Centre. It's a wonderful map with a drawing of the chase. Again, we have to remember that they hadn't decided to always put north at the top. And in this map, north is at the bottom. So you have to turn it upside down too. But here in the lower left corner down here, you can see the three-way fork in the lane, which is going up towards Ewan's Hill from the Garlings and from the football field. A few hundred yards up the lane, the road forks into three. And that's quite clearly what's shown there in the bottom left-hand corner. And Mushes, which is the big kidney-shaped field out at the other end of Ewan's Hill Lane, that's the field here shown in red. So the map is upside down, but the map contains wonderful drawings of animals and trees, all represented by their leaves. But in the various woods, they've stuck little labels. So if we look here, I have to press once more. For instance, right there, if we blow that little section up, we find this coppice Collins claimeth to be his inheritance, but the king's tenants have the pasture thereof, and the king hath the conies. So somebody called Collins is claiming that. Here's another piece. And this says, this is called Stubbs Coppice and is claimed to be Waldron's inheritance, but the king's tenants have the pasture thereof, and the king hath the conies. And again, this coppice Goddard claimeth to be his inheritance, but the king's tenants have the pasture thereof. There obviously weren't any conies in that part of the wood. And finally, one more. This coppice is called Hart's Hook, and it's still called Hart's Hook, Hart's Hook. And it is claimed to be Waldron's inheritance, but the king's tenants have the pasture thereof, and the king hath the conies. So yet again, 1607, there are still things going on, people claiming parts of the chase as being their own, probably hunting deer. It still was going on, and I must come to an end, which is good because I have one more slide. We find one more reference to the Bonds and to the Goddards and their hunting, and that comes from 1635. It comes from a document that's held in the Wiltshire Museum in Devizes in a bound series of volumes called Wiltshire Genealogy. And they're the handwritten notes of a man called John Sadler, who in the early, from the period up to 1924, he must have lived in the old Public Records Office. And for everything that he could find to do with Wiltshire, he copied out and finally had them bound in these wonderful volumes. And this is a document that he's written. One of these days I will go up to Kew and actually find the original. But his notes are Calendar of State Papers, Domestic, 1635. A case on the 16th of October, 1635. notes of Secretary Windbank with reference to the cause Bond versus Goddard. Now, Sir Thomas Bond was, this is after the sale of Aldbourne to the City of London. And the City of London have then sold off the lordship of the manor to Sir Thomas Bond. So Sir Thomas Bond is the lord of the manor. This is the lord of the manor versus Goddard. For hunting, the cause Bond versus Goddard for hunting in the King's Chase called Aldbourne Chase, spelled A-W-B-O-R-N, Aldbourne. The contents of the evidence is stated and the opinions of the judges on the sentence, which was a fine of £500 each to William Goddard Sr. and William Goddard Jr. Mrs. Goddard, Elizabeth, got off free. But a fine of £500 in 1635 is a really serious amount of money to be fined, which shows, I guess, how fed up the authorities were with the Goddards nicking the king's deer. And that, I think, has given my talk through the landowning, through the benefaction, and finally as poachers. So that's really the end of what I have to say. And I'm ready for any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, John. So much detail in there. We keep on. We're never going to run out of detail. Terry is waving at us.
In 1595, Goddards had £2,000. Thomas Goddard had £2,000 debt.
Yes.
1597, there's a tablet over the front door of the church inside saying he set up a charity, £2 a year for the poor of the parish forever. So they must, although they had this debt, they must have got wriggled out of it somehow. May I say, as a managed thing there, most of the charities have been amalgamated in the village now, but the Goddards haven't paid for about 200 years.
I'll just repeat that for the people on Zoom who probably couldn't hear Terry at the back of the hall, pointing out that in 1595 we heard about the debt of £2,000, but a couple of years later, as is recorded in the church, the Goddards set up a charity to pay to the poor of the village £2 a year in perpetuity. And Terry, as I'm not sure if he's chairman or secretary of the parish charities, tells us that the Goddards haven't paid for quite a long time.
It did actually pay for the cost of 10 people, £2 at the time, was quite a lot of money.
I'll nip back to the Zoom. If anyone on Zoom wants to ask a question, you can demute yourselves now, or do it by chat and I'll yell for you. Yeah.
So what's happened to the Goddards since the 1630s?
I've been asked what happened to the Goddards since 1630. Well, I hope they're all watching at this moment on Zoom. We have one in the hall here with us. They split into a number of different families. Stanton Hussey is one, and they went. Sorry, Cliff Piper is another. That's right. One group went to America. Amongst the descendants of that American group is I can't remember his Christian name, Goddard, who was instrumental in creating rocket propulsion. Apparently, one of them became Lord Chief Justice of England, although nobody can quite decide exactly where he fits. But when he was ennobled, he called himself Lord Goddard of Aldbourne. I have another question. Jenny.
I'm really sorry if I missed it, but I don't think I did. When you were talking about the things that they did in the church, did you mention the bell?
Jenny has pointed out, no, I didn't mention the bell.
I didn't think you did. I wasn't too sure. Maybe
Is that the 1516 bell? Yes, that's one thing that I did forget to mention. It wasn't in my notes, but as part of, in 1516, the Goddards donated a bell to St. Michael's Church. It's the tenor bell. It's still in place. It's not only rung every Sunday, still after 500 years, it's also rung several times every hour because it's the strike bell for our clock. And that was a bell given in 1516 by the Goddard family.
But it also shows on in written, and you can describe it in Latin, but it shows that Richard Goddard had 2 wives, which is quite interesting.
Yes.
Not written anywhere else.
Terry has also reminded us that that bell was dedicated to Richard Goddard, he of the brass memorial, and his 2 wives called Elizabeth. Robert.
There's several references in the documents to the chase and the wood separately. Can you explain what the difference was, and do those differences still exist today?
They do, because there is still an area over by the top of Aldbourne Hill. I've been asked about the references in some of the documents which I mentioned to the chase and wood as being separate. The explanation is that the woods are what we know today as chase wood, which is over towards the top of Aldbourne Hill, between there and White's Hard Bottom, the woodland there and across to Stock Close. That was much more wooded in earlier times, and that was the woodland that formed part of the chase. So they weren't separate. The wood was part of the chase. And it was particularly that wood that was always under dispute with our neighbours in Aldbourne. Do we have any more? Do we have any come in, Cassie?
Well, thanks, Patricia. Well, very interesting. Thank you.
Okay. I do hope that our visitors on Zoom from the Goddard Association feel that it was worth waiting the 4 months for what you should have heard back in May. And I'm very sorry that I wasn't able to give it then.
Thank you.
Can I just say thank you on behalf of all the Goddards all over the world for the amount of research that John has done to put this together. I mean, he's gone back so far and he's researched so many things. It's fantastic, and for the Goddard family, it's surely very impressive. Thank you very much, John.
It's been a pleasure.